It's a typical October evening in a sleepy suburban American town. A couple of horny teens have just finished doing the dirty, and she politely asks him to go get her a beer.
Go get me a beer.
To which he, of course, replies,
I'll be right back.
But we all know what happens next. He won't be back. He'll be stabbed to death by a crazed, masked psychopath. And she'll be next. It feels like a tale as old as time, but it's not. It's a tale that dates back about 40 years. One that's been done to death over and over and over again. Welcome to the slasher movie, one of the most prolific, lucrative, and ridiculously fun subgenres of horror. Since the format shot to prominence in the late 1970s following the gigantic success of John Carpenter's Halloween, the slasher has gone through some highs and some lows.
I'm a leprechaun, me dear.
But it seems that in every generation, there's a whole new bunch of young gorehounds hungry to watch a bunch of bodies pile up in increasingly grisly ways. But why? Why do we love watching so many versions of the same movie, in which thinly drawn characters misbehave and die? What's the secret behind the success of the slasher? The slasher is a relatively new subgenre, particularly in comparison to ghost stories, monster movies, or vampire films, which are as old as cinema itself. But where did the slasher really begin? To look at the origins of the slasher, firstly, we need to figure out exactly how to define a slasher movie. And it seems to me you could boil a typical stalk and slash movie down to 4 key format points. Point number 1, a body count. A slasher movie always focuses on a group of characters, usually youngsters, being picked off one by one in gory, violent ways by some kind of monster. This monster could be a regular guy wearing a mask, or he could be something more supernatural. It could even be death itself. Point number 2, kills are key. A slasher movie is pretty thin on story. Don't be expecting complex plots or deep, nuanced character developments.
Just cool your engines.
The main characters tend to be pretty archetypal. The jock, the virgin, the promiscuous girl. And the dialogue between characters in slasher movies is pretty inane.
We have 3 new cheers to learn in the morning. The game is in the afternoon. I have to get my hair done at 5, and the dance is at 8. I'll be totally wiped out.
I don't think you have enough to do tomorrow.
Totally.
It's the kill scenes that matter. They are the tent poles. Everything else that happens in the film is window dressing, it's filler, it's ways of connecting the dots, of moving us from one kill to the next. Point 3, sinners will be punished. Usually the characters who fall at the hands of the slasher monster are being punished for something. It might be something that happened during childhood, or a crime that's been covered up. Or it could simply be something as shockingly sinful as doing drugs, drinking alcohol, or having sex. Basically, in a slasher film, if you're not a squeaky clean virgin, you're toast.
You know, Annie, someday you're gonna get us all into deep trouble.
Which brings us nicely to point 4. There will always be a final girl. Well, almost always. While most classic horror movies tended to rely on male heroes like Van Helsing, who would sweep in and defeat the monsters, in slashers, it's usually down to a sweet, mousy, virginal girl. By the final act of a slasher film, the final girl has usually been put through the ringer.
Help me, somebody!
She's traumatized, she's been attacked repeatedly, she's found the bodies of all of her friends. And to quote Carol J. Clover in her brilliant book Men, Women and Chainsaws, the final girl becomes masculinized through phallic appropriation by taking up a weapon, such as a knife or a chainsaw, against the killer. And that's it. That's a slasher. It's all you need. A body count, a final girl, some element of punishment, and a heavy reliance on kills over story. So, how did this become a format, and where did it really begin?
Michael?
Of course, it seems to be a truth universally acknowledged that the film that started it all was John Carpenter's Halloween. A film about a deranged lunatic called Michael Myers who breaks out of a mental institution and murders a bunch of babysitters on Halloween night. But the seeds of this format were planted long before Halloween. Believe it or not, the origins of the body count structure could be traced back to authors like Agatha Christie. In film adaptations of classic Christie stories like And Then There Were None, audiences were introduced to the 10 Little Indians structure, i.e. a structure that relied entirely on watching a bunch of bodies pile up one by one.
7 little Indian boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half. Then there were 6.
Of course, really, these films were more like mysteries than they were scary horror films. In the early half of the 20th century, most horror films were set in some unfamiliar time or place. Transylvania, a Gothic castle, an exotic land far, far away. But in 1960, the horror genre really burst its way into the modern world with 2 groundbreaking masterpieces. The first one was Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom was about an unassuming, innocent-looking man in modern-day London who had a penchant for stabbing women to death and filming it.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
The other film is, of course, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, also a film about an unassuming, innocent-looking bloke living in modern-day America who just happened to be quietly wearing his mother's clothes and stabbing people to death. In an unprecedented, shocking twist, Psycho killed off its main character, played by Janet Leigh, in the first act of the film, leaving the rest of the movie in complete unknown territory. Psycho was, for so many reasons, a game changer. It was a twisty, turny, groundbreaking psychological horror film that broke all the rules, and everyone was talking about it. But they weren't necessarily talking about the story or the characters. They were all talking about that scene. Psycho became the film where the chick gets stabbed to death in the shower. That became its USP. This was one of the earliest examples in mainstream cinema history that a gratuitous murder became a film's selling point. Excited audiences were flocking to movie theatres to see this infamous kill scene. In the wake of Psycho's success came a run of grisly, gory, low-budget films known as splatter movies, films that pushed the boundaries of taste.
This picture, truly one of the most unusual ever filmed, contains scenes which under no circumstances should be viewed by anyone with a heart condition or anyone who is easily upset.
Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood Feast marketed itself as being one of the most shocking cinema experiences you'll ever have, and gore-hungry audiences ate it up.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie.
And that kind of marketing didn't stop there. Moving into the 1970s, new young American filmmakers like Wes Craven and Tobe Hooper were making grisly, disturbing, exploitative movies like Last House on the Left and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and were using their shocking, disturbing content as part of their marketing.
The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
But these were angry political films. This wasn't the kind of fun, frothy Friday night date movie fare that slashers would eventually become. Meanwhile, across the pond, European filmmakers were also pushing the boundaries of taste, but with a little more style. Filmmakers like Mario Bava and Dario Argento were making Giallo movies. Giallo is Italian for yellow, a term coined for a collection of pulpy thriller novels with yellow covers. They were all procedural Agatha Christie-esque murder mysteries, but with much more emphasis on the murder than the mystery. Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace focused on a black-gloved killer murdering a bunch of fashion models, one by one, in increasingly nasty ways. This was followed by a wave of blood-drenched, sumptuous Italian thrillers, all with kill scenes that were as long and elaborate as their titles. The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, What Have You Done to Solange, Don't Torture a Duckling, Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. Giallo movies proved that death, murder and mayhem didn't have to be cheap, grisly and grainy like American splatter or exploitation films. Quite the opposite. Filmmakers like Mario Bava and Dario Argento proved that gore could be artistic, even beautiful. But in 1971, Mario Bava made arguably the most important Giallo and Proto-slasher movie of all. A Bay of Blood, aka Twitch of the Death Nerve. Much like most gialli, the film worked as a mystery predominantly, involving a mysterious killer, an array of strange characters, and a convoluted plot involving a countess and an inheritance. But there was another element to this story too, one that involved a bunch of young, pretty teens camping out together at a lake, misbehaving, getting their clothes off, and being killed in pretty nasty ways. If there was ever any doubt as to how influential Bay of Blood was, take a look at these moments from the film alongside some key moments from an 80s slasher. It's impossible to ignore the influence that Giallo had on American horror cinema, and particularly the slasher.
Hey, who left the goddamn front door open?
But there was one movie in 1974 that I would argue is the most influential proto-slasher of them all. Black Christmas. This was a little-known Canadian film about a bunch of sorority girls being picked off one by one by a deranged madman hiding in the attic. This film ticks all the slasher boxes. Teen characters, menacing phone calls, an increasing body count, a final girl. It's set on a well-known annual holiday, and it's filled with gruesome, gorgeous kill scenes. It also happens to be one of the best and most terrifying horror films ever made. It's a film that's grown in people's estimations over time, and these days it's generally recognised as the masterpiece that it is. But at the time, Black Christmas wasn't the smash hit that it deserved to be. Unlike John Carpenter's Halloween, the film that launched the slasher genre. Halloween handpicked ingredients from several films that came before it. The body count structure of Agatha Christie, the modern American setting of Psycho, the masked killer akin to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the artistic, sumptuous kill scenes of Giallo, and made it teen-centric, a la Black Christmas. Halloween put all of these elements together, stripped it back, removed any political allegory or convoluted procedural mysteries, and boiled these ingredients down to make one perfect, scary movie. This little indie film starring Jamie Lee Curtis became, at the time, the most profitable horror film ever made. And so, inevitably, studios did what they did best. They took what was popular about Halloween and tried to replicate it. Enter Paramount's Friday the 13th. Directed by Sean Cunningham, Friday the 13th was a title before it was even a film. It shamelessly replicated Halloween, but removed a lot of that subtlety and dread and cranked all the other elements up to 11. More characters, more dead bodies, more carnage. And Friday the 13th added one key ingredient, one that was pretty much missing from John Carpenter's movie: gore. With makeup mastermind Tom Savini behind the scenes, Friday the 13th gave audiences a string of incredibly entertaining and highly inventive kill scenes. John Carpenter, of course, never intended to create a new subgenre with Halloween. He was simply setting out to make an interesting, low-budget, scary movie. Friday the 13th, however, knew exactly what it was doing. Many details in Halloween were incidental. John Carpenter claims that he never intentionally killed off the misbehaving teens and saved the virgin. But Friday the 13th took this subtext and made it text. The whole reason Mrs. Voorhees is killing teens is because they were having sex and allowed her son, Jason, to drown.
Did you know that a young boy drowned? The counselors weren't paying any attention. They were making love while that young boy drowned.
Friday the 13th established those puritanical rules we now all associate with slashers. In fact, Jason Voorhees, and in turn the whole slasher subgenre, works as a symbol, a representation of the evil created as a direct result of sin and promiscuity.
Hey, you want a beer?
Or do you want to smoke some pot?
Or we can have premarital sex.
Which means that for all of its boundary-pushing midnight movie schlockiness, Friday the 13th is arguably in many ways a deeply conservative film. One that plays to the values of middle America and the moral majority.
We weren't doing anything, we were just messing with
That 1-2 hit of Halloween and Friday the 13th, two films that followed the exact same formula and played incredibly well to wide mainstream audiences, solidified the slasher as a bona fide subgenre. And the rest is history. Over the next couple of years, literally hundreds of low-budget slasher films were being churned out by studios and young filmmakers as a way to make a cheap buck. Prom Night, Terror Train, Sleepaway Camp, Slumber Party Massacre, The Prowler, The House on Sorority Row, Final Exam, The Burning, Pieces, not to mention all of the Halloween and Friday the 13th sequels. But as quickly as the slasher rose, it soon started to fall. After this intense saturation of slashers in the early 80s, audience enthusiasm was starting to wane. We had already seen everything we could see. What new ways were there to kill off teenagers? Everything had been done. Bastard! The format needed something new and fast, or else it was dead in the water. Enter horror maestro Wes Craven with his 1984 slasher masterpiece, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Based on real-life news stories about children dying in their sleep during nightmares, Craven took the body count format of the teen slasher but blended it with fantasy. What if you could set a bunch of teen slasher kill scenes in a dream world? Then there's literally no limit to how imaginative you could be. Suddenly, victims were being dragged upside down on ceilings, and teen heartthrobs were being sucked into their beds. A Nightmare on Elm Street beautifully blended grindhouse with art house. The film was, of course, a huge success, and it created an unlikely horror icon in Freddy Krueger. Craven based the look of Krueger on a traumatic experience he'd had in his childhood. He woke up one night, looked out of his window, and he saw a man in a dirty jumper and hat looking straight back at him. Krueger is a nasty, sinister, shadowy, malevolent presence. That spindly physique, the finger knives, the burnt skin, not to mention the tongue. This guy was supposed to be absolutely evil to his core. So then, how did this happen?
You know who's back? Freddy. You see, my name is Freddy, and I'm here to say, I'll wrap you up the tape.
As New Line Cinema began churning out more and more sequels, something weird started happening to Freddy Krueger. No! He started to evolve into this wise-cracking joker, a figure of fun.
Great graphics.
Suddenly, there were Freddy Krueger costumes for kids.
Go back to the boiler room.
Action figures, video games, lunchboxes. Freddy Krueger, this child-molesting serial killer, the one that terrified Wes Craven as a child, was on lunchboxes. The Nightmare on Elm Street franchise continued to be fun and popular and imaginative, but by the late 80s and early 90s, it had lost all of the elements that made the first one so terrifying.
Kids.
The rest of the slasher icons followed the same trajectory. Suddenly, Michael Myers was going up against comedic bumbling cops. Jason Voorhees was taking boat rides to Manhattan. New slasher franchises started to emerge that played more on comedy and wisecracking villains.
You've been very naughty, Miss Kendall.
By the early 90s, the slasher was no longer scary. It was self-parody. Freddy was dead, Michael Myers was no more, Jason went to hell. This seemed to be the end of the subgenre. But, once again, it was Wes Craven that resurrected it.
Hello?
Scream, an insanely smart postmodern masterpiece that was poking fun at the slasher format as much as it was breathing new life into it for a whole new generation. Expanding on similar themes Craven had explored 1 year earlier in his meta Freddy movie New Nightmare, Scream took a bunch of pop-savvy characters who were actually aware of the slasher tropes and conventions and therefore knew how to play by the rules and how to survive their own slasher.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
Written by Dawson's Creek's Kevin Williamson, Scream was smart, witty and cool, but thanks to Wes Craven's direction, it was also really scary. A perfect blend of everything that made slashers work.
Don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos! Movies make psychos more creative!
This was the ultimate commentary on the subgenre.
There's a formula to it! A very simple formula!
It felt as though no slasher could possibly exist beyond Scream.
Not in my movie.
But of course, as we've seen time and time again, every time there's a popular money-making slasher movie, more follow suit. Cue the increasingly inferior Scream rip-offs. I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Valentine, then of course the return of old franchise favourites in trendy post-Scream fashions, Halloween H2O, Jason X, Freddy vs. Jason, Bride of Chucky. These were slick, glossy horror movies. Compared to the early 80s, they relied much less on schlocky kills and more on famous, attractive teens and whodunit mysteries. Just look at these early 80s slasher movie posters with their gruey, gruesome artwork. Their selling point was the gore. Then check out the 90s ones. They were selling these movies on their casts. This wasn't just a horror film, it was a Denise Richards and David Boreanaz film. But soon enough, of course, the trend of 90s slashers fizzled out. I mean, once you've done the whole self-referential ironic thing, where can you go from there? The slasher snake had eaten its own tail, so to speak. But we audiences still had that bloodlust. We still, for some reason, wanted to watch movies where bodies of youngsters pile up one by one in increasingly gruesome ways. Well, perhaps one of the best and most innovative twists on the slasher format was Final Destination. A brilliantly entertaining 21st century franchise about kids literally being stalked and killed by death itself. Final Destination was, in many ways, the slasher in its purest form. We didn't even need a killer anymore. It's just 5 films worth of hilariously shocking, elaborate deaths. By the mid-2000s, the world had changed. We were living in a post-9/11 nihilistic world. The internet was now in every single home, and people were seeing much more shocking, nasty, real-life gruesome images on YouTube or even on the news. Slasher films seemed kind of tame compared to some of the real-life stuff that was on our screens. So, the horror genre had to up its game. The slasher was replaced by something altogether nastier: torture porn. A bunch of new horror filmmakers emerged, ones that had grown up watching those 70s exploitation films. These filmmakers were known as the Splat Pack: Alexander Aja, Lee Whannell, Eli Roth, Neil Marshall, Rob Zombie.
Hello, Amanda.
In 2004, Saw took on the body count and whodunit format of the slasher, but made it much, much nastier. And look at Eli Roth's Hostel. This continued in the slasher tradition of vacuous teens being punished for their sins, but they'd never been punished quite like this before. Even the classic franchise slashers were once again resurrected, but in this grimier, more sickly style. Rob Zombie's Halloween remake was very, very different to the original. But this isn't the subgenre we fell in love with.
That was so fucking stupid. Pure horseshit. The death of horror right here in front of us.
What's happened to the traditional teen slasher movie? It doesn't seem to be at the forefront of the horror genre anymore. It hasn't quite been embraced by young audiences in the way that it was in the late 90s or the early 80s. However, that's not to say that we haven't had some interesting, innovative slasher movies over the last decade. Ones that took what we loved so much about slashers back in the day, but added a modern twist. Look at 2014's brilliant It Follows, and 2015's The Final Girls. Then there's 2017's Happy Death Day. Not to mention the 2018 Halloween reboot, which took the franchise back to its stripped-back, creepy roots. With more Halloween movies on the way, not to mention a new Scream film, we might just be on the brink of another slasher resurgence. And that is because we, as audience members and as human beings, will always have this morbid fascination with watching people die. Before cinema even existed, audiences would flock to live theatre experiences that would shock and disgust them, like Theatre Grand Guignol in Paris. Even Shakespeare had plenty of gruesome, nasty, graphic murder. It goes all the way back to Roman times, when gladiators would fight to the death with blades for the audience's entertainment. Maybe it's simply a cathartic release, experiencing that fear, pain and death, but in a safe environment among our fellow audience members. Whatever the reason, that bloodlust still exists. And if there's one thing we've learnt over the last 40 years, it's that characters like Michael, Jason, Chucky and Freddy always come back.
I always come back!
Which goes to show that the slasher will never stay dead for long. Looking for more horror content? Subscribe now for more videos like this one, and listen to the Evolution of Horror podcast. Head on over to evolutionofhorror.com.